Good evening, everybody. I'm hoping we can get everyone seated and start our evening. My name is Karen Mundy. I am the Associate Dean of Research here at OISE, and as you will know, for many, many years, OISE has prided itself on being the brain trust for education research in Canada. And tonight, we're going to have 4 of the leading change makers in education in Canada and around the world speak with us, starting, of course, with Professor Andy Hargreaves from Boston College. Many of you will know Andy from his work on educational change, including his most recent books, Transforming Teaching in Every School with Michael Fullan, and The Global Fourth Way. And I'm waiting to find out what this fourth way is, because I only know of 3 ways. So the fourth is going to be a new piece to that puzzle. It's the next one. What's so exciting to me, because of my own research, is that Andy's going to draw on the experience of countries around the world. And he's going to talk to us, I think, in very inspirational terms about the way in which change can happen in educational systems that goes against what Pasi Sahlberg calls as the germ, the global education reform movement. And I think in OISE we've been very instrumental in developing a discourse based on evidence about alternative ways of changing schooling. And very importantly, setting out an agenda for change that isn't the agenda that is being advocated perhaps by most of our global institutions, the institutions that in my own work I study. So I'm really delighted. I'm excited to hear what Andy's going to say, and I want to say welcome back to OISE. Andy came to OISE many years ago, left just a year before I came, so it's my first chance to meet him. Very good to have you back. Welcome home. I want to also introduce the panelists, and they have informed me that they're going to self-moderate. We'll see how that goes. As you know, these are the people that are coming to this panel all have very strong ideas. So I hope that the panel will be not only self-moderated, but also very exciting. And I'll just ask them to sort of stand forward. They're sitting in the crowds here. Annie Kidder, from People for Education, certainly one of Canada's, Ontario's certainly most famous change agents in education. Michael Fullan, the former Dean of OISE, we should congratulate Michael because he's the recent recipient of an Order of Canada, so I think can justifiably say that, yes. One of our most senior figures in education, and Ben Levin, Canada Research Chair and Professor here at OISE. Many of you will know his role in the Ministry of Education, and he is also currently on Kathleen Wynn's transition team. And I hope he's going to infuse lots of good ideas about educational change into that transition. So welcome to the panel. Welcome, Andy, and looking forward to it.
Thank you. Thank you, Karen. Well, good evening, everybody. Can you hear me? Yes, great. This morning I spoke to my mother, who's almost 93, in England, in a nursing home in the north of England. My wife is visiting at the moment, and so we were able to talk. She was mainly lying on the bed singing tunes from Oklahoma, and remembering the time I took her there merely as a stripling in her late 80s to Broadway to see it. And as I sort of thought about that and this, they seem to me somewhat similar, which is, and you're probably wondering where the connection is, and so am I. But if I had to go back and give a talk to my mum, it would not be an easy thing. Of course, my mum loves me to bits, even though she's never been effusive about it in an Oprah Winfrey sort of way. She raised me in some of my most important years, and if I were to go back and give a talk to her, because she knows me inside out, she would absolutely not let me get away with a single thing. And this is what talking here feels like. Because I spent many really important years here working. Ben hadn't arrived then, although his ghost lurked around the corridors all the time, as people like Ed Hickox would say, oh, that's just the kind of thing that Ben Levin would do. And Michael was a colleague and also my boss. And so when I was coming back through Toronto this weekend, weather permitting, I'll be working with principals in the Leading Success group tomorrow up near the airport, weather permitting, and then going to Alberta on Monday. I mentioned to Ben that I was coming through and would he like me to do a small seminar? And I thought there's a little glass room, or there used to be on floor 6, and I thought there'd be about 8 people. I did not know he'd be arranging floodlights, this space here, and a death squad to dispose of me at the end, consisting of some of the most prominent people in education, not just in the province, but in the world. I was given the modest topic, I think it's a subtitle, to talk about the future of education in Ontario, which is a good time to think about this issue. As we have a change in leadership, a new premier, a time and an opportunity to think about what the next steps are for this province. Many things have been said in the media, good and bad, for and against, about the identity politics of the new premier. But less mentioned has been something just as important, which is 2 things. One is her background, not as a lawyer or as a business person, but as somebody from the social sector who's worked with communities, who's worked with marginalized, underserved groups. And of course, the second thing, who has her master's in education from OISE. So hopefully we'll have in this next phase someone who can really work with many groups in thinking at this difficult time of economic recession, a point where not all groups have been able easily to agree about the best way to deal with that and move forward, that we will be able to find some collaborative way forward as groups work together to extricate ourselves from this period. It's easy to be innovative when you're prosperous and living high on the hog, because it feels like a luxury that you can afford. It's essential to be innovative when money is tight and your back is up against the wall. It's utterly counterintuitive, because most countries at this time decide to dig in, to hold on to what they've got, to just work harder, to tighten up, to increase accountability, to convince the public that things will not start to fall away and deteriorate. But in 1992, as Pasi Sahlberg, recent winner of the $100,000 Gromeyer Prize for the best idea or book in the world in education, talks about in his book Finnish Lessons. In 1992, when there was 19% unemployment in Finland, they decided that the way out of a big economic hole was not to tighten things up, but to innovate, and to innovate through its children, who would be the future of the country and find its way forward. One of its first steps was to abolish the inspection service, and one of its second was to improve the quality of the teaching force. So I will talk tonight, but not too long, because it's me or a snow day, one or the other. I'll talk about the 4 eyes of educational change. Actually, when I was a child, if they called you 4 eyes, they meant you couldn't see properly in England, but that's not what I mean here. 4 eyes of inspiration, improvement, innovation, and inclusion. We've done improvement really well in this province over the last 10 years or so. Ben and Michael will be able to rattle off much more effectively than I can how Ontario has done in its improvement in graduation rates, in its improvement especially in literacy, less so in numeracy, I'll come back to that, but especially in literacy. It's a world leader improvement. We'll return to this theme soon. The 3 other we'll stick with this eye because you shouldn't have a goal of deteriorating. So I'll argue we want to kind of hold on improvement and then think about where to start some progress in some other directions which have been less front and center in the focus, which is where innovation, inclusion, and inspiration come in. First is inspiration, and if Ken Leithwood were here, but if he has any sense, he's probably in Florida right now. If Ken Leithwood were here, Ken would say that inspiration is one of the core characteristics of transformational leadership. Martin Luther King did not have a strategic plan. Martin Luther King did not say, one day 84% of God's children will reach level 3 proficiency in terms of understanding the wrongs of discrimination by the year 1973. We need plans, of course, but he had a dream, not a strategic plan. The question I think all of us are asking, Michael's been thinking about, Ben's been thinking about, all of us are thinking about, is really what's the next dream for Ontario right now, and at a time when Alberta is finding it hard economically as well. In a way, what is the dream for Canada? Finland, remember, had a big dream when it had 19% unemployment. Its dream was to be one of the world's leading, most advanced knowledge economies, and so it became through education. In 1965, shortly after it gained independence, David Attenborough, the documentary filmmaker, described Singapore as little more than a group of small tin sheds. Within little more than a generation, Singapore moved from being what we would think of as being an underdeveloped country or a less developed country to quickly turning into one of the leading economies in the world with a 16% annual GDP growth rate last year, 16%, much of it built on education. It's when things are hard that innovating and investing in education is so desperately important. So we need to innovate as well as improve. When you're improving, you're doing mainly what you're already doing, but you're doing it better. You're doing it harder, you're doing it more efficiently, you're doing it more effectively. Improvement is about taking a propeller plane and making a better propeller, but it's still a propeller-based plane. Innovation is about doing something new, something different. It's about having a jet engine instead of a propeller-based plane. Still the same function, purpose, but realized in a very different way. What we have to think about is we think about innovation in many different ways. In the United States at the moment, especially, but not just there, people think of innovation not as innovation in teaching and learning, not as new kinds of teaching, new kinds of learning, or even returning to deeper, more challenging, broader, more experimental, creative forms of learning, but think about delivery of learning, particularly through technology, other media. This is often what's presented as personalization. The learning is not fundamentally changing, but people think of innovation as different ways of delivering conventional forms of learning. Innovation, I want to argue, should really encompass both. We need to think about innovation in what is changed, in the nature of teaching and learning, which people from Paulo Freire right through these days to Sir Ken Robinson think about in terms of how to develop greater creativity, greater engagement with the world around them of the people that we teach. And then we also, and they're not either or, they're both and, we need innovation in how to change, in the way that change is stimulated and managed. When you move from an improvement paradigm to an innovation paradigm, you cannot deliver change in the ways you did within a frame of improvement. We've understood this since Rogers wrote his book on diffusion of innovation and how to deal with the boiling of water in Peru. We've understood this more recently since Manuel Castells argued about how people created hubs of innovation in places like Silicon Valley, universities, science centers, other people in networks, all organized in connection with each other. And today, Charles Ledbetter, Tom Bentley, both gurus from England, Ledbetter a former Marxist actually, but now a guru for many governments all over the world, say you can't deliver innovation through pipelines by having an idea here and then you have steps of delivery as it goes through levels to other people. You have to create platforms where people can innovate themselves. Health is a very good example, so that through access through websites, other access to health services, people can begin to manage their own health individually and in communities more effectively, rather than having services sort of downloaded to them. So we must innovate in our ends, and we must think about innovating in our means as well. How we do that, people have different ideas on, and here are about 4 theories, different theories of how innovation will play out and how we should manage it. In his quite brilliant book called The Innovators Dilemma, with the extraordinary, excruciatingly, apparently dull subject matter of the history of disk drives. The history of disk drives. Clayton Christensen talks about how he believes in fundamental ways, and in his subsequent book with Horn, talks about how technology essentially will take over schooling as we understand it through online learning and other forms of access. Because this, he say, will replicate what happened when disk drives got smaller. When disk drives got smaller, you move from the desktop to the laptop, then the laptop to the palm top, then the palm top to the tablet. We moved through different sorts of machines over time. And when the innovators in a company move from one stage to another, they would go, say, to the head of IBM and say, I've got a new device here, except they didn't call it a device then. And IBM would say, that's interesting. Let's see what the customers think. So they'd ask the customers if they like the innovation, and the customers would say, well, we like actually the new device, but we don't like the loss of memory, so we'll keep to the device that we have. Thank you very much. The customer is not always right. The customer is not always right. And so the innovators would become frustrated. They'd go away. They'd set up their own little innovation outfit. They'd start working on something else. And at first it was no challenge to the main company. The first little palm tops were actually GPSs on the dashboards of cars. No threat to conventional computers at all. But then successful innovators don't just play around, drop it, move on to something else. They become disciplined. They become relentless. They keep working and working. Memory grows. The devices get more powerful. And eventually, the laptop comes to threaten the desktop. The tablet comes to threaten the laptop. The innovators return to kill off the parents who abandoned them and turned them out. And this, I sometimes dramatize just a little bit. I was once accused, it was a new word, of over-melodramatizing. You're such an over-melodramatizer, you. But the crucial point here is, it's this theory, studied in several domains by Christensen, that leads him to believe that this is what will happen with technological innovation in education. Then there's the counter theory. Good old curmudgeonly historian Larry Cuban, who's looked at the history of technological innovation in the past, in schools, in television, in teaching machines, and has basically concluded that eventually there's a little flurry, but the school absorbs them because they challenge the traditional pedagogy, and teachers don't like that, and because they threaten the face-to-face relationships that teachers and students and parents all particularly value. So television ended up, and video ended up being used on Friday afternoons when people were tired, when there was nothing else to do, when they wanted a bit of a break, when they needed entertaining. So Cuban's thesis is the opposite of Christensen's, that actually innovation, whatever we try, will ultimately be absorbed by this historic, long-lasting culture of schooling, which is not just, as people now say, old-style Dickensian factory schooling, but is also about the integrity of face-to-face relationships, care, protection, and safety and custody for the vulnerable children who are in our care. It is both of these things. Theory number 2. Then there's McKinsey & Co., published at the time when Sir Michael Barber was really the kind of key person for them. They looked at how many systems were improving from being, merely not very good to quite good, like poor to adequate, to good to better, and so on. And they tried to pick out the characteristics of these examples in places like Brazil or India or South Africa. And what they concluded is that they felt they had a sort of new development theory, which was rather like Rostov's development theories of a takeoff and growth in the 1960s, which is that innovation was only something you could indulge once you'd improved to your max. Once you'd improved as much as you could, then you could have the luxury to innovate. But before you innovated in developing countries, you needed a prescribed curriculum, clearly defined standards, testing and accountability, data systems, until the capacity of your teachers had developed. And only when you'd done all that, only when you'd eaten your broccoli and your Brussels sprouts and your peas, could you then have your meat, and then after that, your dessert. Only when you'd done your math in the morning could you have your art in the afternoon. Only when you'd had puritanical self-sacrifice could you have frivolous self-indulgence afterwards. This is the sort of Michael Barber McKinsey view of a necessary stage of development. Innovation is a luxury once you've achieved and secured your foundation for improvement. Charles Handy and a group of other people like Peter Senge disagree with this. They say you have to innovate before you've finished improving. This is what they call the Sigmoid Curve. Because as you're improving, there comes a point when your actions and your data are out of sync. Your data is lying behind what you're actually doing. So at the point when the data are still indicating you appear to be still improving, actually things are already deteriorating. Things are already beginning to take a dip. So it's paradoxically when you're already doing really well that you need to change it and do something else. Because if you wait for decline, as Jim Collins has also talked about in his work, if you wait for decline, it's probably too late. If you wait for things to flatten off, it's too late. And then, I'm not done yet. The opposite of McKinsey is 2 striking counterexamples. One is Escuela Nueva, a large network of thousands of schools in Latin America, created in Colombia, a prize-winning, award-winning network of schools with proven results in the 1970s that owes much more to Paulo Freire and to Reggio Emilia in its philosophy of learning than it does to an ordered hierarchical form of prescribed instruction organized around the basics. So here's an innovative methodology, progressive, engaged with students, with thousands of schools in less developed countries with little capacity that seems to yield far better results than the alternative. And if you don't like that, Santiago Rijon Gallardo, I'm hoping to meet you in about an hour. Are you here? Hey, fabulous paper with Richard Elmore and in Harvard Educational Review about innovation with 4,000 schools growing quickly, matched against a match sample that outperforms the match sample, built over many years with active learning, project-based learning, an inside-out form rather than outside-in form of development and capacity, with close one-to-one coaching and tutoring to spread the methodology around over time. So we have McKinsey with some examples that favor the hierarchical stage-based development. And then we have the Freire Reggio Emilia sort of whole child-centered, engaging with life and the world around them, both with evidence and examples. Which one is right? Which one is wrong? Are they based on evidence or ideology, Anglo-Saxon or otherwise? Which one should we choose? And the answer is we should have an open mind. What we need is an open mind. Perhaps some are better for some places than other places. We don't know. Perhaps it's a fit of culture and context. We don't know yet. But what we need to do is explore and be open to the alternatives. And if they are both equal, then we should choose between them on other grounds. Which is the better model for democracy? Which is the better model for the breadth of learning? Which is the better model for developing innovative capacities? We should choose on other grounds if they are both equal in all other ways. And then I couldn't find the cover of his book just before the presentation, so his book is not a black hole. It's supposed to be in that space there. But the last thing is, on this theme of innovation, is we tend to feel, as I said at the outset, that we can innovate when we have resources. And when we don't have resources, we should pull back. Alberta now is in an economic downturn, largely thanks to the energy policies of Barack Obama south of the border, which have made Canadian oil and Canadian energy less competitive, because the Canadian market was over-dependent on the American market. So Alberta's in a downturn now, as well as Ontario. Alberta, therefore, is considering very closely whether to abolish the Alberta Initiative for School Improvement, where 95% of schools in a period of 10 to 11 years invested in teacher-designed innovations, so that the culture of inquiry became part of the culture of schools and learning in almost the whole of Alberta. Because it has less money, it thinks innovation is a dispensable luxury. Remember, Finland, at a time when it was economically in the hole, said innovation is the answer, not something that should disappear first. We have some instances of innovation in this province right now with the Ontario Teachers Federation, with the Ministry Teacher Leadership and Learning project, and I think there will be some interesting discussions around the future of that. And I would urge people, whether they keep or lose the project, to keep the idea and to keep the support and to keep the investment, that innovation, however we approach it, is an important priority. So, some of you have seen this before. A way to think about this and to kind of draw this stage together is to imagine if your system were a horse, what kind of horse would it be? The horse might be innovating or not innovating, doing something new or not doing something new. It might be improving or not improving, getting better or not getting better. If you're not improving, and you're not doing anything different, you're a dead horse. You're on your back and the flies are buzzing all around you. If you're improving but not yet innovating fundamentally, you're a racehorse. You're a thoroughbred. You're the best horse there is. But like Mr. Ed, a horse is a horse. Of course, of course. And so is this. It's still a horse. If you're innovating but not improving, and I know this taxes Ben's mind a lot, is the fear and the rightful concern about innovating but not improving. You're a flying horse. You're a mythical horse. You're a Pegasus. You're beautiful, but you cannot exist. And if you're improving and innovating, what are you? You're an iron horse. People think, by the way, that the word iron horse was invented by Native Americans, that the phrase actually it originally came from Northeast England and then came over to North America and was adopted in that phraseology. So an iron horse still has horsepower, more horsepower than any horse that previously existed. But it's no longer a horse. It's a different thing altogether, doing the same job in a different way. If these places were countries or jurisdictions, who would they be? The dead horse is arguably the United States of America, particularly through the last 10 or 15 years of its reform strategy, which has had much more threat than that used in places like Ontario, many more punitive consequences, and considerably less support. Although recent data are suggesting that through the International Maths and Science Studies, that places like Massachusetts and Florida under Jeb Bush may be performing close to, and in some cases even better than Ontario. So we may have to revise our opinion of the United States. Then, if you're the racehorse, you're at the best improvement there is. You're the fastest horse there is. Arguably, this is what I would call the received view of Ontario, disseminated by OECD, McKinsey, and the US National Centre for Education. Strong on literacy and numeracy, tight focus on 3 priorities, good results, moving, progressing steadily, not too quickly, which is what sustainable change is, all the time around those clear areas of focus, but not doing anything especially wacky or odd or creative around the edge, other than apparently poking the top of the CN Tower up the bottom of the Statue of Liberty, which was not my intention when I first created this graphic. If you're innovating but not improving, it's our worry that we engage and indulge in new technology without any serious thought as to how that actually improves teaching and learning. If your classroom cupboards are stacked with iPads and nobody's using them, you are the winged horse of educational change. If people are using them superficially, a recent article in Educational Researcher indicated that about 1% of uses of new technology in the United States are actually significantly addressing the deep issues of teaching and learning, whereas 99% are not. If this is you, you are the winged horse of educational change. So what do we do? Who is in the bottom right-hand corner? Who is innovating and improving? And the answer is, we don't know. We can have some guesses, arguments. Could it be Alberta? Could it be Finland? Could it be Singapore? We don't completely know, but this is the cell to look at. This is what we need to focus on. So I'm going to whiz past one or two things here. As we approach that bottom cell, our challenge is to take on what Jim Collins describes in his book Great by Choice. And that is what he calls disciplined innovation. And disciplined innovation means, just like the people who dealt with the shrinking size of disk drives, that innovation isn't just airy-fairy, try one thing, move on to something else, let it go. But innovation with disciplined innovation means you keep working, you're relentless, you are indefatigable. You keep moving at the same thing all the time, trial and error, refinement, perfection, until you get it right. Discipline, however, should not be misunderstood. Discipline, says Jim Collins, is consistency of your action, that it's consistent with your values, your goals, your performance standards, and over time. Discipline does not mean regimentation. Discipline does not mean measurement. Discipline does not mean hierarchical obedience with higher or centralized authorities. Discipline does not mean adherence to bureaucratic rules. The only true discipline is the self-discipline of relentless persistence and dedication to what it is that you're trying to create. So how do we combine innovation and improvement in that way? It's odd because in our children, we need to teach them to be creative, to experiment, to try new ideas, to work across disciplines, to engage with new media, to connect with different cultures, and also those old-fashioned virtues like deferred gratification, persistence, discipline, focus, which new technologies often take away from you. We need somehow to combine the creativity with traditional 1950s virtues and values in our classrooms and in our schools if they're going to be successful. And then we need to add one thing to all that, and that is inclusion. And Jim Ryan, when he talks about inclusive leadership, really means two things. It's an unusual concept of inclusion. Inclusion, which we think of as applying to special educational needs, of who's included rather than excluded, and whether the outcomes are inclusive, so different groups all achieve well. And then the second, says Jim Ryan, though, is that the process should be inclusive. That whether you're dealing with culturally diverse populations, people with special educational disabilities, as you find, discover, implement programs that help them, the way you do that should include many voices, many people, many cultures in the way you create and adapt the change together. Inclusion is a process as well as an outcome. It's a great little book, by the way, is Inclusive Leadership. Hardly anybody knows it, but you absolutely should. It's a great little book. So these were the issues we explored, and I'll spend about the last, 10 minutes on this, in our recent evaluation with my colleague Henry Brown, also born Canadian, a Jewish Montrealer. Aren't too many of those. And Henry's a great quantitative expert. Henry and I worked collaboratively with 10 school boards, a seventh almost of the school boards in the province. Some of you are here. It's great to see you, and I remember and recognize you and value having worked with you so closely on this to look at the implementation of the 2004-2005 strategy based on the document Education for All, which was really about developing a new, more inclusive philosophy towards special education and children in general, based on the strategy that what is essential for some children is good for all children. You want to help children with special educational needs and disabilities. You really need to think about how you change your whole curriculum and how you change your whole school. So these were some of the things that EFA focused on: universal design for learning, differentiated instruction, ways of thinking of assessment for, of and as learning, literacy and numeracy, as the other reform emphases were, professional learning communities and assistive technologies that could help children with learning disabilities. So we looked at the 10 boards. We paid 3-day site visits with teams of 3 to each one, so that's about 90 days of field work in total. We surveyed 9 of the 10 boards. One had a change of leadership, so we couldn't get the results from them at the time we were doing the survey. So we have quantitative and qualitative data from all of these. And if you want to look at this, go to my website, worldwideweb.andyhargreaves.com, and you can download it and the shorter executive summary from the first page. What are some of the things we learned from this? Actually, as you can see here, and I'll show it you quickly, in a project which significantly improved the writing results of special needs students with learning disabilities, and which is one of the areas where the province successfully was able to narrow in one of its key goals, along with English language learners, was one of the key areas where it was able to narrow the achievement gap. So what are some of the things we learned? Here's 10 of them. First, we found in the project that leadership came from many places, not only from the top. It particularly came from a group of superintendents, special education superintendents, who really wanted to, in about 3 ways, first of all, connected with Ben as Deputy Minister, and really were saying, we felt like second bananas, they said. The principals are engaged, the teacher federations are engaged, lots of people are engaged, but we're not engaged at the moment. We'd like to think that this is an area where we can get engaged too, where we can show some leadership within the province. And then when they got $25 million of funding that initially they thought was for 1 year, they took the unusual strategy of giving the same money divided equally to 72 boards. So Toronto would get the same funding as a tiny school board with 2 schools in it. And this was a little controversial, as you can imagine. A little controversial. But the argument was, the thinking behind it is that actually most school boards in the province are small. And so the amount of money that makes a tiny difference in Toronto makes a huge difference to that large number of school boards. So it really engages the commitment of the majority of school superintendents and directors. It creates a critical mass of collective leadership behind an important change. And then the big boards, the larger boards, were brought along by saying, look, what you need to do is you don't have money, but you can do a pilot project, you can scale it up, you can connect it with your other resources, and symbolically you can show some leadership to the rest of the boards by working alongside them. So there's leadership from the middle by the critical mass of superintendents. And then each board had its own strategy, which was networked with each other. And a team of existing and former superintendents, particularly former ones, would work closely with the boards, going back and forth, looking at their plans, making sure they met a core set of very general but firm criteria, and helping them figure out how they could connect their unique populations to the inclusive goal of meeting the needs of all learners. Leadership needs to come from many places in educational change, not just from the top. And what we've learned in Ontario is that that has already existed, but is not as well publicised as it could be. There's leadership from the teachers, with the Teacher Leadership and Learning Project. There's leadership from the principals with School Success. There's leadership from the superintendents and the directors here. Second, this is a quick one. The change literature, there's been a sort of convention in the last 10 years that if you want to change people's beliefs, you have to change their practices first. That people aren't always comfortable with something you're expecting them to do. So you have to kind of nudge them into it, and they have to feel that discomfort, and then they realize, oh, this works. and then their beliefs change. And we found many examples of this in the project, but we also found the opposite, that people were very inspired by education for all, that they shifted their beliefs about what special needs students with learning disabilities were able to do. Beliefs were as important for changing people's practice as the opposite. The whole world's religions are based on the idea that beliefs change your practices. If you're Jewish, if you're Catholic, if you're Protestant, if you're Buddhist, if you're Muslim, whatever you are, and even if you're atheist and you have a humanistic belief system, what's the point of having a belief system if you don't think it changes your practices and guides your practice sometimes in terms of what you do? We are a bilingual, multicultural society. That affects what we do. It shapes who we are, how we act. Beliefs also change practices as well as practice changing beliefs. And this is one thing that this project drew us back to. Third, with 10 boards with different diversities. Diversity should be a plural, not a singular. Many different kinds of diversities, and the strength of this project in allowing local innovation was that the board with a high Mennonite population, where many students were leaving before the minimum legal leaving age, realized it could not impose attendance requirements because the families would simply move to another of their Mennonite communities in another area, but had to make a generational change in forming relationships with those parents and communities to build up the value of education. Or in the immigrant community north of Toronto, many recent immigrants, where the focus was on early childhood literacy and resolving a battle between two ideologies of literacy in early childhood that was structured or play that was unstructured, and finding the answer was structured play. Because as John Dewey understood, the answer is usually both and, not either or, between the two. Or the Aboriginal community in the north, the First Nations community, 40% of the school board First Nations, where they realized quickly if they're going to improve literacy, what they needed to focus on first was oral language, spoken language, not written language. Or the Franco-Ontarian community, where identity is as important as achievement, and emphasizing play and games is as important as focused achievement. They're all different diversities. And just on a global scale, as Mexico and Colombia should challenge our Anglo-Saxon norms of what is effective systemic reform, so too should these different diversities in the province lead us to think in more sophisticated ways about the flexibility we leave for local implementation, innovation, and development over time. Fourth, the project made great strides, as did many aspects of the literacy strategy and the use of data, in collective responsibility. This is not my child. This is not a child I'm attached to as a special education resource teacher. But the money follows the instruction. It doesn't follow the resource teacher or the child. That the grade 1 teacher is as responsible for the grade 6 students' achievements as is the grade 6 teacher, because the child used to be in grade 1. And the province has been very successful through its literacy reforms and through the special education work in building this ethic of collective responsibility, including in school boards, some of whom have merged the curriculum departments with the special education departments. I'm not going to go through all of these, you'll be relieved to know, but I'm going to just touch on a couple more. We saw this is somewhat controversial, but perhaps not as much as it might once have been. The province, as Michael has documented recently, has shown significant progress, not only of children up to grade 3 level 3 proficiency, but also of children from level 1 to level 2. And of children up to level 1, which is foundational literacy, functional literacy. But what many teachers feel we found quantitatively and qualitatively within our study is that the movement to level 3 is valued and publicized more than the movement to levels 1 and 2, because that's where the systemic emphasis had been. Good leaders knew not how to indulge the tendency to concentrate overly on kids near the borderline of proficiency. But some leaders in our study did not, and some school districts did not, and despite the energetic work of Ben Levin to the contrary, going round the province telling people not to focus on the borderline kids, not just because it was wrong, but because it actually wouldn't work. Some districts still did have charts in the office showing who was on level 3, who was 2.7, 2.8, 2.9, and with a bit of work, how many they thought they would get to level 3. This is not a question of intent. In just about every target-driven system that exists, you will find this, and not only in education, you'll find it in health, where there are targets for the timelines that people spend in emergency. And when the targets are very high stakes, the ambulances will drive people round and round and round until they can be admitted and processed within the specified time. They game the system because they're afraid of the consequences. It's a feature of the system, are you with me? Not a feature of the intent. So in order to deal with this, we're now at a point in many systems, including in this one, of thinking, how can we move a bit more explicitly, not to moving towards a target or a final goal, but measuring the growth. Keep pushing the growth. Keep pushing the growth. And as long as you're growing almost every year, that is the thing that matters. Because if you push too hard on the target, and the closer you get to it, if you become more obsessed with finally making it, you get what Oliver Burkeman, in his recent book, which is called The Antidote, a book about happiness for people who hate positive thinking. It is, of course, written by an Englishman. If you read this book, he has a whole chapter on the danger of investing too much in goals. And it describes the catastrophic failure of the Everest expedition over 10 years ago, when many people died. The closer they got to the summit, even though they knew it was lethal, the more committed they were to getting there, even though they knew there was a high chance it would kill them. And everywhere, we need to beware of summit fever. And even if, though we're close now to the targets, I would probably argue, don't kill yourself to get that sweat out, that last 2 or 3%, but pick another peak. Pick another peak to go for and begin ascending that instead. I'll finish with this one, actually. There's a paradox of assistive technologies. And Michael and Ben and I are starting somewhere thinking about innovative professional development and the use of technology. And frankly, my interest in this, as a tiny aside, is that if we can use more innovative professional development, including the use of technology, we can more explicitly value teaching as relative to other professions, teaching as a profession which can value and support the flexible hours of family life and childcare as an asset, not as a liability. If technology will enable us to engage with each other as colleagues at flexible times, not defined by the explicit hours of the school day. And I'm sure my Federation colleagues will chew my ear on that one way or another afterwards. But all I want you to know is my interest is in how it can support that, bring in high-quality people who value family life and the flexibility and cost of childcare arrangements, which will give them advantages compared to some other professions. In technology, what we found with assistive technologies is gains for students in achievement who use sound to text, text to sound, kidspiration, posters, sound systems if they had ear infections. We found gains in self-confidence, gains in self-advocacy, gains in all of these three areas, unless when they went back to their regular classroom, their regular teacher in, say, 8th grade, grade 8, made little or no use of technology as a routine, not an obsessive, but as a routine part of their instruction. So the paradox is, kids who found devices that would help them would take those devices into a regular classroom, and in those regular classrooms would find that they were the only child with a device. So they would give up the very thing that could help them because it would stigmatize them more than not having a device. We don't have a choice anymore if we want to be inclusive, to use technology or not use technology. What we have choices about are how well we combine technology with effective pedagogy. I've talked a long time. It's fairly predictable. I always do. And I'm not going to show you all of these. Well, I'm going to show you, but I'm not going to tell you them all. I just highlight 3 or 4. Avoid summit fever in the next period. Don't get drawn into summit fever. It's time not to withdraw from the mountain, but it's time to find some new summits to go for as well. What will they be? How will we approach them? Create platforms for people to innovate instead of trying to drive all innovation through from the top. How can we do that? Hear different voices from different communities at the table so we can recognize and engage with the many diversities in the province rather than thinking of diversity as one particular issue. And last but not least, 4 lines down, what I would ask you to think about is what E.P. Thompson, the historian, called a moral economy. In a moral economy, he pointed out, in the food riots of the 18th century in England, when the economy was declining, but the elite were living high on the hog, there was a sense of unfairness that people were starving at the same time. They were seeking a balance. They were seeking a moral economy where everybody shared in some way in the hardship that was being inflicted. One book written a few years ago says that actually Canada probably has the best moral economy there is in the world, where people work together to share out the benefits and also the hardships of the society. We are in a downturn. We're $17 billion in debt. It's about 14. Just wait a while. You know, Margaret Thatcher used to say, somebody asked Margaret Thatcher, could you advise me how to set up a small business? And she said, well, first of all, set up a large one and then wait. So as we move forward, for me, and it's easy because I don't live here at this moment, but my children live here, and I will eventually one day live here again, and hopefully die here, but not too soon. That this is a time really for people to come together and to think, okay, we've got to save money, but to decide together where the money is saved, not for one person to dream it up somehow, somewhere from the top. And counterintuitively, as we're thinking about how to save money, don't regard innovation as a frill or a luxury or as an indulgence, but as an absolute necessity on which the future of this province and this country may well depend over the coming years. Thank you for your time. Thank you for listening. Yeah, you have to,
BYOC.
yeah. It's a fairly low-end lecture, is this? You have to bring your own chairs.
Yeah.
Okay, who's going to start? So what we are going to do is give some very quick responses to the very rich set of ideas that Andy gave us. Each of us could probably do quite a long response. We're not going to do that. Some very quick comments, a little bit of discussion here, and then an invitation for people in the audience who want to participate in the debate. You want to go first, Andy?
No, I want to go last.
Okay.
Oh.
You go first.
That was good. See, I like that. That was good, yeah.
I'll go first
I
then.
can respond to that.
And I think only one thing that I want to talk more about, and that is the kind of distinction you made between innovation and improvement as being in different boxes. And to me, they're not. I put it this way: there is no improvement without innovation, although there is plenty of innovation without improvement. And by that I mean that improvement rests on doing something differently than you've done it before. And I'll use excellent for some, good for all as an illustration of how that works. So the goal of improvement was clear. Excellent for some, good for all was about trying to help more kids be more successful in elementary schools, closely connected to our goals. But as Andy has pointed out, the whole idea was fairly innovative, of doing this, the way in which we did it by actually turning over the responsibility to directors and superintendents. The way they organized it, as Andy pointed out, had another layer of innovation. So I want to argue there's many nested layers of innovation that happen in any kind of initiative or improvement effort. And then, of course, each of the boards, as Andy also pointed out, had a somewhat different way of going about it. So they had some innovative elements they built in to this other level of innovation, which was below another level of innovation. And then you can follow it all the way down, as the analogy goes, right, to individual schools and the way they took it up, and individual teachers and the way they took it up. And I think you could look at every improvement effort and say, there must be, in an improvement effort, an approach of some kind to innovation, although I certainly agree often those approaches are not articulated and sometimes they're not intelligent. But to me, those two things are inextricably connected. You cannot have improvement without innovation, although, as I said, you can have lots of innovation without any improvement. I'll stop there.
Okay, two sets of points for me. One, my pre-point is, I agree, I think, with everything.
You can't have a pre-point.
But that's 3 points, isn't it? Okay. We're not doing so well in numeracy, you know that.
Nobody expects a Spanish Inquisition.
Different ways of using numbers. Everybody knows that. So, I agree with everything that Andy has said, and so I want to go to the next step. One set of things is that you have to do the work, keep an open mind about the strategy, and accelerate the quality of improvement and innovation. Those three things. And I mean do the work. I mean teaming up with actual systems to do this, not study it. And so that's the major message. If you're going to make any headway on the insights that Andy talks about, you have to get in there and doing it. And I want to use my second set, maybe 5 quick examples of work that we are doing. In fact, Andy and Ben are part of several of them. One is, they're not in order, I'm going to leave Ontario to the last. One is we are working increasingly in California, where the strategy is to change the system through leadership from the middle. You'll be happy to know, Andy. That is school districts and combinations of school districts. California has 1,000 school districts. Lots of them are small. We are teaming up with a variety of strands of them, and their explicit strategy is to change the system from leadership from the middle, laterally as well as vertically. So that's one example. Second one is we're involved, the three of us, although I never can quite tell whether we're doing the work, in Alberta, especially through the Superintendents Association, Andy with the union as well. The three of us go out several times with the whole group, and so we're definitely part of the evolution of what's happening in Alberta, and a very continuous part of it. And so I look to that as another vehicle for this to see some changes develop through this. Third example I want to use is Australia. Again, lots of things going on, and Ben is particularly engaged there as well. Several states, ACT we spent some time with, now Victoria, New South Wales soon, Queensland, a very active collaboration with people at different levels of the system to do that. And then the second last example, and this is really I want to reinforce what Andy said, is Latin America. Uruguay we've been involved in recently, Steve Anderson and Nancy Watson and myself, soon with Peru, probably in Mexico with San Diego and others. And so in each of these cases, it's a chance, because the capacity is very much low. We certainly would not take improvement first and then you can innovate. It's going to be innovate from day one and improve from day one. And it's going to employ strategies that are already proven to a certain extent that you can get large-scale quality change in a short period of time by accelerating the strategies of change and building and leveraging the grassroots and having the lateral development that comes from that, as well as the seeing it show up in the whole system. So very different paradigm and model of change. That's what I mean about keeping an open mind, trying something deliberately different or leveraging something deliberately different and doing that. And then the last one I want to comment, of course, is Ontario. The Premier asked me to do an exit paper. He was exiting, I wasn't. As far as, yeah, we don't know. And so,
relationship?
I took the ideas that I've been influenced from Ben and Andy already, as you can see in the paper, because it says keep doing good continuous improvement and move forward, and then do focused innovation in the area of early learning, for example, and the 6 C's that the higher learning skills, which are already happening in various parts of the province. What I would say about Ontario is we haven't had any focus on leading change from the center since May of 2011. In other words, it's been a long time since it's not just the labor dispute that's diverted this. There was the pre-election. Of course, everybody's distracted at pre-election. And then there was the election, but the election didn't result in any new initiative. So the strategy in Ontario is stale. And the momentum, not the labor dispute part, that just is an obvious aggravation, but it was already stale before that happened. And so what's needed next is to, and there's a lot of energy, as Andy found in the Leadership from the Middle study, already great things out there, but unless there's a rejuvenation of this work with some new things of focused discipline and new partnerships and new development, it's not going to go anywhere. I do want to comment, I know you'll count this as point number 4, professional capital. I'm going to say one of the things we're doing now in all of these projects, and I hope I speak for Andy in saying this, is we are trying to openly infiltrate professional capital agenda in all of the systems I'm talking about. Professional capital means increased human quality and talent. It means social capital, but if you have social capital without the third one, you can have people who don't necessarily have the expertise influencing each other. So definitely the social capital is there, but it's not very much quality. And the third one we had was decisional. And decisional is when you're doing the work together again in a very specific way to learn and build and work on the evidence and the skills. And so this is the agenda, I think, and it should play itself out in different circumstances with different models, but it still has the do the work quality. It still has an open and explicit mind about the particular, especially the way you go about it, the strategies, and it still has to have the goal of accelerating quality change with results along the lines of the 4 I's, for example. So thank you very much. I look forward to some comments from you. Annie?
I think I have more questions than I don't have answers. And after this, a part of me goes, improving what? And I think that's one of the things that, I think the 4 I's are important. But I do think we have to think about when we say the word improvement, is there an assumption in there about what we're improving? And I think that right now there is an assumption from the general public that we're improving some pretty defined, fairly narrowly defined things, which are very, very important, and we should be improving them. So I guess when you talked about being disciplined and relentless, I'm more in the relentless school than the disciplined one, but I'm going to stay there.
I've got a new tube on
Yeah, good. But so one of the things that you didn't talk about, you talked about prioritizing other outcomes. And so my question has to do with, I was really interested in you talking about not targets, but more the growth, and and trying to figure out how we have goals and measurement, which I happen to think is very important, without targets, and how do we sort of wrap our brains around that? But when you talked about prioritizing other outcomes, if you prioritize other outcomes, do you have to do that? Do you lose the progress you're making on the ones that you have already prioritized? So if we think of Ontario and that we have set as a priority our scores, the targets in reading, writing, and math, and maybe our graduation rates, if we go, okay, there's some other, when we're talking about improving what, there's some other things, there's some other priorities here we really need to look at. They partly have to do with the 6 C's that Michael's talked about when we think about health and well-being. What are we doing in that overall, all the things we know about health writ large, not, just whether or not they're getting any exercise, the little darlings. But so that when we're thinking about those things, are there ways of setting, prioritizing other outcomes and figuring out what those outcomes can be? This is the work People for Education is engaging in the next 5 years. Over the next 5 years, how do we not lose one? So when we talk about a priority, the assumption is one is above the other. And so how do we sort of keep in mind, what are we trying to improve? And is there a way of really articulating that clearly so we do have goals, but maybe not targets in the way that you talked about? And how do we have new or different or add on to our priorities in a way when we talk about then maybe broader outcomes without losing sight of any of them, without saying, reading and writing isn't important. Of course, reading and writing is incredibly important. And of course, I happen to think even measuring our progress in that is incredibly important. How do we balance those things out? That's it.
So
this is the self-moderating part.
Right. So I think what I'd actually like to do, because we're at inside 20 to 6, we're going to finish by 6.
Good.
We need to give Andy a bit of time at the end to respond. So I think what we'd like to do is just get some comments from the audience. And the ground rule I'm going to set is they don't need to be questions, but they do need to be short. So we're not giving you preambles or long contextual explanations.
No pre-points.
That's right. Michael got the only pre-point in the evening. But let's hear a few, and then we'll have some response from Andy and others.
My name is Salihin, and I'm a doctoral student at OISI. But I kind of have a question, so if you allow. It's about the innovation, and I'm looking at it, an improvement. I'm looking at it as a policy made by, let's say, a collective few, and the product imposed, generally visioned or closely looked into it, to the mass people. Then where does democracy play into it? Is one thought that's hovering in my mind. Thank you.
Okay, we got a couple more questions, comments?
Hi, my name is Steve Barry. I'm a recent doctoral grad from SciDec, and I was really interested to hear your reference to Escuela Nueva, because we talk about that a lot in comparative education. But you're also talking about leadership comes from many places, and I wanted to hear more about your thinking and your work on parents, community organizations, and so on, because particularly the non-formal programs like Escuela Nueva have a huge input from NGOs and parent groups and so on, and they do a significant amount of localization of curriculum to fit the local needs.
Great. Couple more?
You talked about leading from the middle, and there was a mention of superintendents, principals, teachers. I want to know where students figure into transforming the leadership within the school communities. And as well, we talk about parent engagement as well. I talked to a group of grade 7 students today about assistive technology and bringing different kinds of devices, which they already have and they know how to use, but which scares the living daylights out of their teachers. So I want to know, in all of this talk around innovation, where is there room for this student leadership?
And maybe one more.
Hi, I come from Peru, and I just heard you mention that you might be working in the future for our country. And as a matter of fact, we're a group of 17 principals here in Ontario right now taking a course because we want to help improve our system. My question is, when you said that the situation is that complicated, you said that there is no time to wait for improvement and then innovation, that you have to start from day one doing both things. Can you explain a little bit more about that? Thank you.
Okay, who wants to plunge in on any of those? You want to start with that last one, Michael?
Sure, and maybe also say about the students as well. I'm sure we'll take it over. In the technology integration work that Andy referred to, it's very clear that that the new development that has the most potential is teachers and students as partners in learning, with increasing control on the part of students, not just individually but collectively, over what they learn and how they learn, and that, but in relation to a teacher as activator is the word that John Hattie used. And so I would say that pedagogically speaking, there's a very deep role for students, individually and collectively, with technology being a major part of that, as well as deeper learning. So I'm now talking about the nature of the educational work is such that it's conducive to students having an increasingly explicit and powerful role. Again, not just as individuals, but also as groups. So I think that's one. On the innovate and improve from day one, I guess, and we need a long discussion about this, because one way of saying this is that if you're improving, you're focusing on some things where we might know how to implement and make some progress. But at the same time, we have to experiment with innovative ways of doing that. And so the improvement focus and the innovative, I guess I would say about innovation, it gives you more of a license to learn as you go, to try to develop things, to learn from it. It's more of a deliberate experimental learning, lean startup proposition on the innovation side. But on the improvement side, you also want to consolidate and see what's being learned, and arriving at agreements about that certain things should be spread, and I'll say certain things should become eventually non-negotiable if they work so well, and there's a lot of evidence and lots of people are using them. So for me, today's innovation is tomorrow's improvement, and tomorrow's improvement is the next day's innovation. It's both, always, and that the innovation, you have more leeway to experiment and development, and you deliberately support that as a system. But you also want to consolidate sometimes and focus on those things that are working. So we don't, we all would, all three of us, Andy hasn't been part of this discussion around innovation and improvement, have slightly different versions, because that distinction itself is just being at the early stages of deciding what are the ins and outs of doing both of those simultaneously. And how are they interconnected, not just as two separate strategies. So it needs more work, but definitely I think on the right track.
I think that the idea of the many voices, that when we're talking about, going back to what Michael said about it's been a kind of dry period in Ontario, which I think is true in a way, and that there's a kind of need for a renewed vision, or maybe a better articulated vision for education, that democracy piece that somebody brought up first has to do with being able to listen to a lot of different voices and include a lot of different voices, and understanding there aren't students who speak with one voice, and there certainly aren't parents. Parents don't think anything. They think a whole bunch of things. But I think that what's hard then in this idea of innovation and listening and improving and changing is, how do we include all those voices without paying more attention to the ones that are louder, have more social capital, are more likely to always be the ones at meetings. And how do we also then recognize expertise, so not necessarily say because it's from the grassroots it's right, but actually understand that there is expertise, that we do have to have evidence, that it is important that there's constantly that balance and sort of remixing. So for us as an organization, part of it is how do we continually have a kind of communication strategy around education. The thing I've always argued with about the academic world is it sort of speaks its own language and talks to itself, even though you're doing very important work about knowledge mobilization. But even the word knowledge mobilization, maybe you could call it something else that people would understand. Yes, those two words. Communicating, for instance. But I think that what's really important is getting this conversation out into the world, and how can we all work together? Students, parents, organizations like ours, which is a kind of combination of a whole bunch of things, but has a lot of expertise now in communication. How do we put those together so that it is democratic and not imposed, or not just driven by very simplistic politics, because some things, there are political promises that are easy to kind of sell and maybe keep, but more understanding the big messy world that education is. Over to you.
Well, first of all, I just want to thank everybody for coming out in the face of an appalling weather forecast. And I just hope everybody gets home safely this evening and is warm fairly soon.
In Toronto, we like appalling weather
Yeah,
forecasts.
I know.
We don't like appalling weather forecasts.
Sometimes we exaggerate.
Yeah. Actually, they almost set targets on weather forecasts, They give you a target for 5 days, but it's never reliable, because if you look at the forecast in 5 days, it bears no correspondence. Well, if you look at the actual weather, it bears no correspondence to what people said it would be. But it gives people a sense of security that there's a target that in 5 days, we will be at plus 4 degrees and we all feel more secure about that. I believe there is improvement without innovation, and you saw my piece of paper that came across, and it's not a bad thing. I think we improve when we try harder. I think we improve when we practice more. I think we improve when we give it extra time. I think it's neither a good thing nor a bad if it's something we value. I think practicing, giving things more time, working harder, it's improvement. It's good. So I don't know what that means for the overall analysis, but I think the racehorse still lives is what I would say. Many questions actually are addressing other voices, students, parents, non-formal learning, and so on, and about leadership coming from all these places. In the Global Fourth Way, one of the things that Dennis Shirley and I talk about, and I should tell you that my co-author Dennis Shirley wrote the first book in America on community organizing in education. So long before it became fashionable, he did work with the Industrial Areas Foundation in Texas and did some really actually innovative work in the importance of the parent engagement, community engagement, and so on. The question is if the leadership should and does come from many places, but not yet here or almost anywhere enough from students. Where is a focus for all that? And one answer is the locality, is the town, is the district, is the board, because the board represents, or should, the parents and community, and not just the professionals. And in pretty much all high-performing systems that Dennis Shirley and I have looked at, though this is not fashionable, and Ben's just written about this on the global agenda, one of the things that is highly correlated with successful performance is strong districts, strong local control, strong municipalities, strong connection to your community, strong understanding of your diversities, strong capacity to be able to respond to that over time, strong basis for teachers to develop and create their curriculum collaboratively, in their community, for their community, with their community, and not only to implement a curriculum that has come at them from somewhere else. So the community builds the capital, develops the professional capital of the teachers, as well as engaging all those other voices. And one of the threats of an economic downturn anywhere and everywhere is the threat of merging school boards, of combining them, of making them into such enormous units that they will eventually turn out to be not a focus for professional effort or a way to represent and engage local democracy, but they will become large regional units of intermediary administration of central government policies. In America, they're deliberately destroying and eviscerating school districts by creating charter schools. In England, they've practically already done it through the development of academies. If we're not careful, because we just think we're trying to save money and we combine our school boards into huge units, we'll destroy the locality and democracy by stealth rather than by market intervention. And I think we should that we should improve them, and we should even innovate in them as well. But we should defend the existence and importance of those districts and communities for all that engagement to the last. No, I know you agree with that. Yeah.
I think we're going to call an end there. I think we're at 5 to 6. So call on Joe Flessa, a colleague here, to say.
Hi, I'm Joe Flessa. Is this on? Yeah. I'm Joe Flessa. I'm a professor in admin, and I will, for at least one person, be better remembered at the end of this than my four far more well-known colleagues, because I'm giving the door prize. And I will choose one person who is going to have the lucky benefit of being able to take one of the books in the back from the continuing and professional learning group. So you put your names on a little piece of paper. I'm going to pull somebody out. And this person is Daniela Bramwell. Hooray! Okay, I was also asked by OISE's Continuing and Professional Learning Group to give a thank you to the audience for coming on a very snowy day, a thank you to our panelists for spending their time. I have a card from Continuing and Professional Learning for all of you, and the takeaway for me tonight was just going back to something that Andy said at the beginning, which is, to think about educational change as a dream, but not having a plan seems to me to be decadence. To have a plan without a dream seems to be a waste of time. And without that, I want to, let's give a round of applause to our panelists for their time today.